And it's 4 minutes after 10. Honestly, you wait days for a senior politician to come in and to take calls on LBC, and then two turn up at once as Boris Johnson hops on the 247 back to Downing Street. So Sadiq Khan arrives at Millbank to take your calls, although not in the same room as me, which is an early warning that there may be some gremlins in the system, although I doubt it, and indeed I hope not. So I will announce the name of the caller and the location, and then hand over to the Mayor on each call. If you want to be one of those callers, then you know what to do. 0345 60 60 973. It's 10:05, and good morning, Sadiq Khan.
Good morning, James. It's great to be back in an LBC studio, albeit a couple of miles away from you.
Just a couple of miles. You last time we spoke, it was on the eve of the weekend of protests against the anti-racism protests that had unfolded the previous week. You were calling for people who believe that Black Lives Matter not to come to London, and hoping that far-right elements also stayed away. How do you feel about how events transpired?
Well, James, as ever, I always try to be honest and candid when I'm on this programme, and I was explaining my concern about the far right, the extreme far right, turning up at the same time as Black Lives Matter, ostensibly claiming they were there to defend statues, but to stand up for what they believe in, and it could have led to all sorts of problems. I'm really pleased that actually the vast majority of Black Lives Matter movement protesters stayed away, but you'll have seen from the images on the TV and listened on the radio the huge violence generated by the far right, the extreme far right. The statues that they claim to have come to protect were boarded up anyway. And it doesn't give me any pleasure in saying I told you so. But what's important is, I think, because those who feel strongly Black Lives Matter stayed away by and large, because our brave police did such a good job. Although there was violence, although some police officers did receive horrible injuries, the level of harm to our city and injury to people and police was less than it otherwise could have been.
While we're on the subject, you may be more across this than I am, but there's been a sort of conflation of the phrase Black Lives Matter with the organisation, quite a mysterious organisation. I couldn't, for example, tell you the names of any people responsible for running it or indeed operating their Twitter account, but an avowedly Marxist ideology put out under that sort of official banner, including calls for things like the defunding of the police. How do you navigate that? How do you navigate the importance of the message, the simple statement Black Lives Matter, and the fact that that is a phrase popularised by an organisation that seems, let me choose my words carefully, that seems to be rather more controversial than the simple statement Black Lives Matter would allow?
Yeah, no, my response is very simple. I think you've got to distinguish organisations from the movement. If you feel strongly that black people suffer racism, discrimination and inequality, and it's wrong, and you think something should be done about it, then you're probably a supporter of the movement Black Lives Matter. There are various organisations that have sprung up also claiming to support the movement. You don't need to believe with what they believe in to support Black Lives Matter. And I think it's really important, those of us who feel strongly about this, are anti-racist, don't go on the defensive because an organisation or two who also claim to support this movement have policies that you and I would, I'm sure, disagree with.
For example, defunding the police or some sort of deconstruction of the capitalist system.
Absolutely.
Let's crack on with the calls then. Daniel can kick us off in Golders Green. Daniel, what would you like to ask the Mayor?
Good morning, James. Mr. Mayor, I was wondering, could you please explain to Londoners, especially key workers in London, police officers, teachers and other essential key workers, why, at a time when we've been told by the government to avoid travelling on public transport if possible, you've narrowed major roads in London, increased the congestion charge to £15 a day and extended the hours till 10 o'clock at night and made it 7 days a week, and especially at a time when when the shops in London desperately need people to come in and shop and support them. Perhaps you'd like to explain why. I'd be really curious to know why you've done that.
Well, thanks, Daniel. It's probably a question that you should have asked the previous guest, Boris Johnson. Let me explain why.
That's the only time I'm going to let you do that, just so you know. I'm not going to allow any more passes back to the previous guest in this studio. I mean it. I want you to answer the questions to the best of your ability.
He was the Prime Minister. He's the Prime Minister, to be fair. So Daniel, to answer your question head on, the previous Prime Minister negotiated a deal with Transport for London, and by the way, similar deals were negotiated with transport authorities across the country. The difference with TfL was we had conditions attached with other transport authorities didn't. And one of those conditions attached by Prime Minister Johnson, the previous guest, was that we must immediately reintroduce the congestion charge, but we must also widen the scope and level of charges. And that's why we've had to, as a condition of receiving the grant from the government, increase the congestion charge and widen the scope. So it's now £15 to come into the C charge area from 6 a.m. till 10 p.m. The second issue is in relation to why I'm encouraging people to walk and cycle. The answer is very simple. What we don't want is a car-led recovery, because what that would lead to is the streets in our city come into a gridlock. And so what we're trying to do is to encourage this awful virus to be used as an opportunity to encourage more people to walk and cycle. One of the things people say to us why they're reluctant to cycle is because it's dangerous, because they are in the midst of big lorries and cars, etc. So we've introduced more segregated cycle lanes. The way to do that is to take some space used by vehicles so cycles can use that space. And the good news is, Daniel, we've seen over the recent weeks record numbers of new cyclists travelling to work or to shops using their bike, and we're keen to encourage that. And what I'd be keen to see is that temporary increase being made permanent.
Daniel, come back to the Mayor on that one, will you?
Yes,
if you want.
Thank you, James. I would like to. Thanks for the opportunity, James. Mr. Mayor, I hear what you say, but you've said it's temporary, yet a lot of the infrastructure all over London that you've said is supposedly temporary, like on Park Lane, is permanent. You've built concrete cycle. Look, there's nothing wrong with increasing and making cycling safer. I'm 100% for that. That is a good thing. But you said you could do it with plastic planters and plastic bollards. You've done it all over London, Finchley Road, Swiss Cottage, Park Lane. You've done concrete things. You repainted the roads. And in some major arterial roads in London, there are now 3 lanes for a bus lane and 1 lane for traffic. And as a result, the congestion is appalling. So how does that help air pollution?
And also, if I may add to that, how do you prove that the responsibility for these increases lies with Downing Street? Because they, of course, insist robustly that it's an autonomous decision, that it's all on you, while you insist that it's all on them. For the average punter, and not to mention the average commuter, that's a deeply unsatisfying state of affairs.
No, I agree. That's one of the reasons why I got permission from the government. They've refused to give permission, but I did it anyway, which is to publish the document where the conditions are laid out. And so it's on my Twitter history, and I can publish it again today, so listeners can see the strings attached to the giving of the grant from the government, which, by the way, is a sticking plaster. The grant comes to an end in the middle of October. In relation to Daniel's points, most of the walking and cycling is temporary, although some of it is good quality, so it appears to be permanent. But the temporary structures will be in place for some months now. I think the Prime Minister and I would agree that COVID-19 will be with us for some time, Daniel. So the bad news for you, who doesn't like to see cycle lanes in Park Lane and in Finsbury and in Swiss Cottage, is they'll be there for some time. I'm hoping a lot of that can be made permanent. Before we make it permanent, we'll have to go through certain hoops to consult properly, and people like you who are anti-cycle lanes in Park Lane can respond to that consultation.
Sort of middle of October then, when all bets are off, so to speak, what do you expect to happen then?
So we've started talking to the government now. The problem with negotiations is often the really crunchy stuff doesn't happen right till the end. So last time we were negotiating for 6-7 weeks, but only at the 11th hour, a day before the deadline, when we basically would have run out of the monies we need to guarantee we can provide services for 2 months, did the deal be done. We're hoping it doesn't go to the wire. We're hoping at an early stage we can explain to the government that for the foreseeable future, not just TfL, but every transport authority in this country will need subsidy, because the reality is for the foreseeable future there won't be sufficient numbers of passengers using the public transport to get the fares in for us to provide the services. Just to remind listeners that we basically rely upon 80% of our services being provided by the fares we receive, plus congestion charge and advertising. More than 90% of that has gone down because fewer people, for good reasons, are using tubes, trams, buses and overground. For the foreseeable future, that will still be the case, as we've got to adhere to social distancing. So we will need, for the short to medium term, some government assistance. It can take the form of operating grant, or the government could devolve to London more powers around business rates, around council tax, around land value capture, so we can pay for some of those services ourselves, or a combination of the two.
14 minutes after 10 is the time. Mayor of London Sadiq Khan taking your calls on 03456060973. Richard is in Clacton. Richard, what would you like to ask the Mayor?
Oh, hello there, Mr. Mayor. Thanks very much for taking
Good morning,
the call.
Richard.
Good morning. I'd just like to refer to your comment that you just made, and you've made quite often over the last couple of weeks, with regards to the far-right thugs that were causing violence and destruction in London 2 weeks ago. I just wondered exactly how they were so violent that the Met reported that 6 police officers received minor injuries on that day, whereas the peaceful protest the week before, they received 62 of various degrees of injury. So how was they so violent?
Well, firstly, Richard, you used the word thugs, not me. Were you there, Richard?
No, I was not there. No.
Okay, so you're relying upon what you saw on social media and on the TV and listened to the radio. Firstly, the numbers you've given for the numbers of police officers assaulted isn't accurate. I've not got the number with me, but it's far higher than the number you've given. I spoke to police officers during the course of the day, afterwards and before, but also have seen some of the reports. Let me firstly say, without any equivocation, I do not condone at all, and I condemn unequivocally any violence against our police, whether it's done by those in the weekend before, as you referred to, who claim to be part of the Black Lives Matter movement, or those in the weekend after by the far right and by the extreme far right. Actually, I was criticised by people when I came on James's show last time for using the phrase far right and extreme far right. In fact, the next day when I did a BBC interview, I was stopped and told not to use that phrase in so-called terms. I think actually, Richard, the actions of a certain percentage of those on the Saturday, I think reinforces and confirms that I was right to call them the far right and the extreme far right, not simply because of the salutes they were making, not simply because some of the songs they were singing, not simply because of the chants some of them were saying, but because of some of the racist abuse used by some of them towards our police officers, but also by others as well. And what could have happened, Richard, in my view, if there'd been, Black Lives Matter protesters meeting with some of these groups, far right and extreme far right, in Parliament Square or Trafalgar Square, I fear could have been some serious violence and fights. So, I pay tribute to our police. Too many have been the victims of assault, violence, verbal abuse, and far worse, and it's simply not acceptable, and I will condemn it, whoever is responsible for doing it.
I've asked you variations on this question quite a few times, but I'm always interested in your answer. Well, one of the military veterans present that day who objected very robustly to the idea that you described him as far right. When he was interviewed, he contended that he thought you should be shot as a terrorist, and this was one of the people who was ostensibly objecting to being described in the words that you used. How do things, when you see things like that on the television in front of you, how does it make you feel?
Well, look, I mean, I don't want people to feel sorry for me, but of course it's upsetting. But what I'd say in response, James, is I want you just to think as a human being how my wife feels when she sees that, or my children, or my mum, or my brothers, or my sister, or my nephews, or my nieces, or people who work with me and people who love me. And so I know how distressing it is for them, and I always remind myself, every person like him, who Richard wouldn't call a thug, there are hundreds and thousands, and dare I say millions, who are the opposite in our city, in our country. And so it's always important that both you and I have a sense of perspective. For all those who are marching that Saturday, people that I call far right, extreme far right, there are literally millions who would condemn unequivocally what they were marching for and campaigning for, and would have condemned that bloke as well.
Well, they weren't entirely clear what they were campaigning for. The chap jailed for urinating next to the memorial to PC Keith Palmer said he was in London to protect statues, but he didn't know which statues. That was the sort of character you were seeking to describe, I think.
Yeah, quite. And so it's one of these things where you're damned if you do and damned if you don't. And I'm really happy for somebody to give me a better description of these people in relation to what they were seeking to do. What I can tell you is, if somebody simply visited some of the website of some of these groups, I want to encourage this, on the Friday before the Saturday, it was quite clear who they were, what they were seeking to do, but also some of the intelligence and briefing that I received, it was clear what they were seeking to do as well.
Peter is in the West End. Peter, what would you like to ask the Mayor?
Oh, hi. Thanks for taking my call. Good morning, Mr. Mayor.
Good morning, Peter.
Well, my question is, given that so much power seems to be deferred to number 10, and you seem to be blaming number 10 for decisions made in London, can I ask, what is the point of having a London mayor now? How can this be justified for London taxpayers?
Well, Peter, I'll take you back to something that the previous mayor used to talk about. He'd talk about how centralised we are as a country, and he actually commissioned a report called the London's Finance Commission Report. And what this talked about was how we can make London have more powers, but also other cities and regions around the world. And the best way to explain this is we in London, we get to spend 7% of the taxes raised in our city. In New York, they get to spend 50%, in Tokyo 70%. And what we're trying to do, Peter, working with colleagues in Manchester, Liverpool, Bristol, elsewhere in the country, is lobby the government to devolve more powers to cities and regions across the country. Because one of the things that those who were campaigning for us to leave the EU were saying was, take back control. And I think the best way to take back control is not for some of these powers and resources to go from Brussels to Whitehall, but for these powers to go from Brussels to Whitehall and then out to City Hall, to Manchester, to Liverpool, to Sheffield, and around the country. And Peter, I genuinely think the closer the decision makers are to the people affected by their decisions, the better those decisions are. So you're right, Peter, I'm frustrated, and just like the previous mayor was frustrated about the lack of powers that I have. What I try and do is work with the government where I can and try and lobby and persuade them why they should devolve more powers to us. So, for example, one of the things I'll be doing over the next few weeks with the Department for Transport and the government in relation to the monies we need from the government around TfL is say, listen, rather than you every few years having to come up and give us money, why don't you devolve powers to us around business rates, around council tax, around land value capture, hotel levies, so we can be in charge of our own destiny. So I'm not always coming to you for more resources, but also so I can't finger point towards you. It's in your interest, government, to give me these powers, because then you can actually wash your hands of it. The problem now, Peter, is it's the worst of both worlds. We're given the responsibility without the resources.
I'm not sure you directly address the question he was asking. I'm going to simplify it, if I may, and say, if you weren't there, if the office of London Mayor wasn't there, would we notice?
I think there are some things you would notice, some things you may not. So you'd notice things around policing, around some of the transport policies. You'd notice things in relation to the big improvement in relation to affordable homes since I became mayor. Record numbers of council homes, the largest number since 82, 83. The largest numbers of genuinely affordable homes since the mayoralty began. Some of the work we're doing around air quality. So you can't have a situation where Danielle's ringing in complaining too many cycling lanes because of me, and then Peter's saying, what's the point of the mayor? And so lots of things we've been able to do in relation to our city over the last 4 years. I'm frustrated though, like Peter, that I'd want more powers to do even more. And sometimes that will mean that people can criticise me, legitimately so, by the way. I don't begrudge that. In a democracy, we've got to be held up to account. There should be checks and balances. But I'm keen for more powers, more resources, and that will bring with it greater scrutiny, which I'm up for.
Are you moving out of City Hall? Is that just something under consideration, or is it actually going to happen?
No, we're consulting. I want it to happen, not because I don't enjoy my office. It's a great office, it's a great view, it's a great part of London, but because we will save over the next 4 years by us moving out £55 million. And when I look at the budgets I've got, and I look at the reduction in council tax revenues because of COVID, business rates revenue because of COVID, but lack of support from the government, we're losing over the next couple of years £500 million. So I've got to find ways to save money. I've already voluntarily taken a pay cut, but if I move out of City Hall, we can save £55 million. And that's money I can use in frontline services, whether it's police, whether it's transport, whether it's a fire service, rather than paying a landlord money for a nice office.
When might that happen?
So there's a break clause in our lease. The contract was signed in 2002, and we've got to, if we're going to take advantage of any move, we've got to take advantage of the break clause. That would mean serving notice by this September. It's a 1 year notice, and we would actually leave at the end of next year. We'd have to give notice this year, and it's a 1 year period before leaving, after giving notice.
You mentioned COVID-19. The Prime Minister in this studio not long ago contended that we are over the worst. Do you agree?
Yeah, I think we're over the peak, the first peak. I think looking back now, the data, I get regular data, around April the 10th, that sort of time was the horrible bit. We're talking about hundreds of deaths on a regular basis. So that peak is behind us. The key challenge is this, though: how we avoid a second wave, a second peak. Previous pandemics in previous years have told us actually the second wave is worse than the first wave. So my concern around this Saturday, and I think it's wrongly characterised as Super Saturday, is we could inadvertently assume it's a return to business as usual and accelerate a second wave. And one of the things that could compound the hurt, anguish and pain caused by a second wave is it happened at the same time as the winter flu concerns we have. And so it's really important we're all aware there almost certainly will be a second wave. The idea is to make it as small as possible, but do what we can to mitigate against that.
This is the heart of it, isn't it? Because you know as well as anybody how important it is for London businesses to start getting, and this holds true across the country, of course, but you are only the mayor of London. It's crucial for them to start getting money over into the tills to start business getting back on something remotely resembling an even keel, and yet every step in that direction is potentially a step away from COVID-19 security. So what would you say to people listening right now who haven't yet decided what they're going to do tomorrow?
Well, firstly, the way you've just described it is the sort of honest conversation we've got to have. There are contradictions here, and there are risks. So what I'll be doing on Saturday is going to my local cafes and restaurants, enjoying good quality coffee and grabbing a sandwich, shopping safely, responsibly, and in a way that respects the fact we're still in the middle of a global pandemic. What I would ask your listeners not to do is to assume it's New Year's Eve or Super Saturday. That means don't go into I'd say respectfully, don't go to the pub as soon as they open at 11 a.m. and spend the next 13 hours drinking and acting in a way where you don't realise we're in the middle of a global pandemic. You've got to keep your social distance. You've got to realise that this virus could spread very easily. And what I don't want to do, James, is be back on in 2 weeks' time talking about a new spike because of the way some people have behaved on Saturday. So it's not me being paternalistic, it's just me doing what you tried to do, which is to explain there are compromises here. So yes, of course, our businesses, hospitality, cafes, bars, restaurants, pubs, they desperately need custom to help them, and so we should support them, but do it responsibly and do it safely, and do it in a way that we don't inadvertently have a situation where we're having to talk about record numbers of deaths and positive infections.
There's some polling for the newspaper this morning that will encourage you. It suggests that fears of a wild weekend are rather overblown, and I know one of the pubs near me is only accepting bookings with a 2-hour limit and a £40 per head minimum spend. So the idea of turning up at 11 o'clock and staying there till closing time is probably not a very likely risk. Yeah,
I mean the thing is, firstly, can I just thank all the responsible businesses across London. You described one of them. I was at a cafe yesterday, Coffee Chapter in Hammersmith. Really responsible at getting ready and stuff. My concern though is, and I've got to be honest with you, is some of our pubs will be showing live football, big screens, and there's nothing wrong with enjoying football. I love live sports. I love spending time with friends. But let's just remember, we're in the middle of a global pandemic. We've got to still keep our distance, 1 metre plus. The other mitigations, follow the one-way signs, and make sure we don't inadvertently pass the virus on.
But briefly, actually, to go back to Peter's question, oddly, could you have made any decisions that would have rendered London different from the rest of England? Because we know that Scotland and Northern Ireland and Wales are having different reopening days, and the so-called air bridges. Nicola Sturgeon rather unhappy with a sense of being railroaded into things she doesn't consider to be secure. Do you have any leeway to do things differently?
No, very, very little, if at all. So we are, and actually, I'm not critical of there needing to be message clarity. I think there'd be nothing worse than me saying one thing, Boris Johnson saying something different. But actually, I've got very little powers in this area. I've even got very little powers over, James, so-called local lockdowns. And so, heaven forbid, if there was a breakout of this virus in a certain part of London or a certain place of work, I'd have very limited powers as well. And one of the things I'm lobbying the government for is learn the lessons of Leicester and make sure that you work with me and the councils to make sure we have the powers should, God forbid, there be an increase.
In a word, had you been in charge of this decision, would you have reopened the pubs on a Saturday?
No.
Nick's in Kensington. Nick, what would you like to ask the Mayor?
Hello, Mr. Mayor.
Hi, Nick.
You failed on housing. Your fare freeze for TfL has been a disaster. You failed on Crossrail 1, you failed on making the case for Crossrail 2, and you have failed to support the government on Brexit, COVID and Heathrow. Are you really a mayor for this city?
I'll take it, Nick, you're undecided how you're going to vote next May. But let me deal with each of those points. So on housing, when I became mayor, in the year before I became mayor, the previous mayor began three homes for social rent. I began more than 7,000 last year. I've also increased the numbers of homes we've started. So last year we began more than 17,000, a record. The year before more than 14,000, a record. The year before more than 12,500, a record. And we've now started building more council homes than any year since 1983, 1982. And so we're making progress in relation to house building, which is really important, bearing in mind Londoners can't afford to live in our city. And I don't apologise, Nick, I'm not in favour of luxury penthouses sitting empty or properties being built for foreigners to use as investments. I've got nothing against foreigners, some of my best friends are foreigners, but I think housing should be for Londoners. So in relation to housing, I'm really proud of my record. In relation to Transport for London, when I became mayor, the deficit TfL had was £1.5 billion. I've reduced that by more than 71%. So before COVID began, our deficit wasn't £1.5 billion, it was £200 million, with a plan to go into surplus by next year, 71% reduction in deficit, but also I increased our cash balances from where it was to more than £2 billion, an increase of 16%, which meant that we could weather the storm of COVID for more than other transport authorities across the country. At the same time, Nick, I froze fares, helping the average London family £200, and also introduced the hopper, helping large numbers of Londoners. You're right, though, I haven't got Crossrail open when I was supposed to get Crossrail open, and I apologise for that. We've looked to learn the lessons in relation to why that happened. The DfT and TfL were co-sponsors. We've learned the lessons, and we've now got more control over the project in relation to Crossrail, and I'm optimistic going forward. In relation to Crossrail 2, though, Nick, it's a bit rich for you to criticise me for Crossrail 2 when it's the government that's been delaying giving the green light on Crossrail 2. We've had to prepare so many business cases for the government because they did everything and delaying on Crossrail 2. In relation to Heathrow, I've been consistent on Heathrow, actually, Nick, and now the government agrees with me in relation to no new runway at Heathrow. I was the person that supported a legal challenge. In fact, I helped bring the legal challenge, which was successful in the High Court and the Court of Appeal. I don't apologise, Nick, for trying to stop runway 3. I think it'd be catastrophic for air pollution, catastrophic for issues around noise pollution, and bad for our city and the environment. And by the way, Nick, the state of the aviation industry, I hope you're not blaming me for that one as well.
What about not supporting the government on, did you say coronavirus, Nick?
I think Nick said COVID and Brexit.
So should you have done more to support the government on COVID-19?
I think history will show, and I'll be publishing when there's a public inquiry all my correspondence and all my conversations with the government, some of the concerns I've expressed in relation to COVID, and I think they've made a huge error over the last few weeks in relation to COVID. It's really important we learn the lessons in real time. I think, Nick, it benefits nobody if we have group thinking around COVID. I think even Boris Johnson this morning admitted they'd made mistakes in relation to COVID-19. In relation to Brexit, I think it's the biggest act of economic self-harm our country's ever done.
It just announced shortly after the Prime Minister left the studio, actually, that the number of people who died with COVID-19 in care homes is estimated to be, is known now to be just shy of 20,000. But let's move on to Stuart, who's in Tunbridge Wells. Stuart, what would you like to say?
Well, thank you for taking my call. I just want to clarify the situation with TfL not supporting the bus drivers when people get on the bus and they're not wearing a face mask or a face covering.
Let's just let's clarify what the story is. As you understand it, Stuart, the bus drivers have been told they don't have to force passengers to wear, or they don't have to order passengers to wear masks. Which is that the story you're referring to?
Yeah, they can refuse travel if the passenger doesn't want to pay or hasn't got a ticket, but they can't refuse travel if they have a face covering, and yet that's part of the government guidelines.
Sorry, James, I'm not clear from Stuart. I think it's my fault, not yours, Stuart. Sorry, can you just explain what?
Well, it's being reported that drivers. I mean, Stuart and I both understand the story, although I think we should probably see it rather differently. Drivers can't throw people off the bus if they're not wearing a mask. So TfL is banning them from insisting that passengers wear masks.
Sorry,
so I saw the story, oddly, just for clarity, because we could both be right, I think, Stuart, and I saw the story more as not making it the driver's responsibility to make people wear masks, because that might add to their burdens in the job.
Yeah,
but what's the reasoning behind it?
Okay, so let me explain. So Stuart, there is on our buses plastic perspex coverings to protect the bus driver, actually, between the bus driver and the passenger. That's really important. But that perspex screen is also there to prevent bus drivers being the victims of assault. I'm afraid the bad news is our bus drivers, like other members of our public transport family, often are at the receiving end of not just verbal abuse but physical assaults as well. And I feel quite strongly that we should do what we can to keep our bus drivers and others safe. It's not the job of the bus driver to enforce this. It's the job of both the British Transport Police, and we also have enforcement officers whose job it is. And one of the reasons I think that's been important is it prevents any animus or anger towards a bus driver when he or she is doing nothing more than simply explaining what the rules are. Now, so what's happened is, from what you're saying, is there's been a concern that bus drivers will be disciplined if they're not enforcing the rules. Not true. So we're saying to bus drivers, you've got to make sure you look after yourself and your safety. Don't try and police something that you haven't got the training to police. You can radio in, and what they do is they radio in, Stuart. We've got very good technology, and then what happens is at the next bus stop or the one after, a BTP officer or a specially trained TfL enforcement officer gets on the bus and takes action against the person not wearing the face covering. I should just say, Stuart, there's sometimes a good reason why somebody's not wearing a face covering. They could have a respiratory issue, some other illness, and children aren't required to wear it. The good news, though, is by and large during rush hour, more than 90% of people are wearing face coverings, and on average during the course of the day it's between 85 and 90%. These are
where are you getting those numbers? Where are you getting those numbers from? Because I mean, I know the plural of anecdote is not data, but I see a lot of buses, and I'd say it was closer to 50%. The producer catches the 38 every morning, and for the last fortnight she's been arriving at work furious at the absence of masks on buses, and that's before rush hour.
Yeah, so our staff TfL keeps numbers, our staff keep numbers, and so there's a different number between rush hour and when you average out during the course of the day. And so we keep a running tally, and it's been going up incrementally over the course of the last few days. And what Grant Shapps announced yesterday was extending the powers to give other TfL staff the powers to enforce if they need be. I've got to balance those, Stuart, making sure none of our staff are, inadvertently make themselves less safe. And so we've got to make sure we work with our staff at the same time as trying to enforce these really important face covering rules. I'm somebody, by the way, James, who wants to extend these rules. I think anybody who enters a shop should be required to wear a face covering, and I support Nicola Sturgeon in Scotland, who's made it mandatory there, as have many countries around the world.
And some states in America, where of course the situation is absolutely dire now. Let's go to David, who's in Paddington. David, what would you like to ask the Mayor?
Morning, Sadiq.
Hi, David.
Morning. It's a question in two parts. Part one is, do you support Israel's annexation of the West Bank? And part two is, therefore, do you think the leader of the opposition, Keir Starmer, should make a statement as Boris Johnson did on the matter?
Thanks, David. Well, firstly, I don't support the annexation of the West Bank. And by the way, I think it's possible to be critical of the policies of the government of Israel and not to be perceived as being anti-Semitic. It's really important that we're allowed to do that. I think Keir's been quite clear in relation to this, David. I saw something that Lisa Nandy said earlier this week and last week, and the Shadow Foreign Secretary will not say these things without the support of the leader. And she was quite clear when Lisa made her statement, Lisa Nandy, the Shadow Foreign Secretary, that she had the full support of Keir Starmer. And David, if you want, after James O'Brien's finished his programme or during it, you can just check what Lisa and Nandy has said, which is supported by Keir, which is also against the annexation of the West Bank by the government of Israel.
10:38 is the time. When you've checked up on that, David, if you're not happy, let me know and we'll raise it again next time the Mayor is here. Let's go to Maureen in Hammersmith. Maureen, what would you like to say?
What I'd like to ask the Mayor is, when does he intend to bring back the Freedom Pass from 7 o'clock in the morning to 9, which really affects me? I got to help my daughter with her children. It's costing me now £10 a day to go now. When does he intend to bring it back? It's really inconvenient for me.
Yeah, no, thanks, Maureen. I know it is. I mean, we tried to resist this one, and we managed to persuade the government.
I hear from you that every journey matters. Obviously, my journey doesn't matter.
No, Maureen, look, I'm really sorry you've got to pay now to use buses before 9 a.m. As you remember, before the deal with the government, you were allowed to use for free your Freedom Pass before 9 a.m. We think when we do the deal with the government in October, we'll try and make sure that we can get this changed. It has affected people like you, Maureen, and so when we negotiate with the government in the next part of the deal, which comes to an end, I think October the 15th or 17th, we'll try and see that the next part of the deal we do with the government allows people like you to be able to use a Freedom Pass before 9 a.m. The reason why the government were quite keen on this, to be fair to them, it wasn't a money-saving exercise. It was because, and I agree with them on this, we were trying to reduce the number of passengers using public transport during rush hour. But you're right, people like you who have to use it because you've got to take your daughter on journeys are being penalised, and you probably can't afford to pay the fare before 9 a.m. I hope to have news when we've concluded the negotiations in the middle of October. We'll have to wait and see what the strings are attached to the deal. At the same time, we'll have to wait and see what the rules are in relation to social distancing.
That's not good enough, is it, Maureen?
No, it's not good enough. You know, I'm here from Ireland 55 years. I have never in my life, this is the only thing that I have ever sort of free, if you say, you know, and now I feel a little bit, you know, I can't afford to £50 a week. I just can't afford to do it. My daughter's a teacher. She can't afford to pay me. You know, so what do I do? I'm in limbo.
Yeah, Maureen, there has been. We've managed to get the disabled older person's card being used before 9 a.m. Is yours a normal? Is yours a 60 plus Freedom Pass or?
Mine is just a normal Freedom Pass. Yeah.
It's a 60 plus Freedom Pass.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So as you know, that's still, you're still able to use it after 9 a.m. but not before 9 a.m. after 7 a.m. Until at least the middle of October. That'll be here. You asked me how long it'll be here for. It'll be here for at least until the middle of October. And once we've had the negotiations with the government, we'll know how far forward they're going to extend it. We're quite clear with the government, it's got to be temporary. We don't want this to be a permanent thing. You'll be aware, though, Maureen, you know, the point the government is saying is outside of London, nobody's allowed to use it before 9 a.m. when we're trying to explain to the government why things are different in London, but also people in London, the cost of living is far more expensive, and so we're keen to make sure that we can make the temporary period as short as possible.
Prince Andrew's friend Ghislaine Maxwell's been arrested on charges of sex trafficking and perjury. Sorry to move along, Maureen. Do you think he should talk to the FBI investigators who are very keen to talk to him?
Yeah, he really should. For a number of reasons. I think it's really important for those of us in positions of power and influence to lead by example. And so it's really important that he should. But also, we shouldn't lose sight of the fact who the victims are. The victims were children at the time. Vulnerable children, young women, and it's really important that anybody who's got information helps the FBI, and that includes Prince Andrew as well.
I think the final question comes from a chap who's becoming something of a regular on LBC. It's Monty in Hampstead. Monty, what would you like to ask the Mayor?
Yeah, good morning, the Mayor, and good morning, James.
Morning, Monty.
Thanks for taking my call. I kind of launched a campaign called #SaveOurTheatres and wanted to know when will theatres will be open in London, and also are there any schemes or government schemes that can help financially theatres, because I think about 70% of them probably go bust with the current state.
There was one in Southampton went under yesterday. There's fears that even the Royal Albert Hall could be in serious financial jeopardy. I know that right across the arts there is profound concern that when we come out of this current catastrophe there'll be very little left of our theatrical infrastructure. Cameron Mackintosh, of course, issuing perhaps the starkest warning of all.
Monty, let me just be unequivocal in my support of the campaigns. I'm part of some of these campaigns, and I've been quite clear. One of the reasons that London is special is because of the contribution made by culture and the creative industries, from theatre, live music venues, pubs, etc. So there are a number of practical things that we're doing. We're also lobbying the government, Oliver Dowden, to do far more. James alluded to Cameron Mackintosh. Cameron Mackintosh is somebody who's a successful producer. He is saying none of his theatres will open until at least next year. but also theatres across our city and country are in danger of closing down permanently. Some who have been furloughed will be made redundant very soon. A number of things that people can do. We've launched a scheme called Pay It Forward London, where Londoners can, it's a sort of crowdfunding, pay for a good or service which helps with cash flow. And so we're helping, the Hackney Empire, for example, have received £40,000 because of this. And so what Londoners can do, Monty, is take advantage of Pay It Forward, which helps with the cash flow to keep our theatres and culture going. We're also, I'd say to Londoners, the Old Vic, for example, have got a great, Matt Smith, Claire Foy production taking place. You can watch it, stream it from home. That helps with cash flow as well. But also, I'm worried about the likes of the Royal Albert Halls, the South Banks, the national theatres, who, unless the government steps in, and with the best will in the world, we haven't got the money to step in, Monty. We've given £2.3 million to culture in the last few weeks to get them through this crisis. But we're faced with a situation where live music venues, LGBTQ plus specialist venues, the smaller theatres, the medium-sized theatres, but the commercial theatres could be lost forever unless the government steps up. You'll have seen, Monty, this week some of our most famous artists expressing their concern about the lack of support from the government. One of the things that we're lobbying the government for, Monty, is for the furlough scheme to be made flexible and extended for certain sectors which, with the best run in the world, can't open on Saturday. Think of hospitality, think of the theatres, etc. going forward. And so I'll continue to do that from City Hall, Monty. If you want more information, go to Pay It Forward London, or some of the information on my website.
Can you offer any finance? Can you push any money in the direction of London?
Yeah, I'm investing £2.3 million already. Yes. I announced it a couple of weeks ago. Separately, the money we're doing with what's called our Growth Hub, we're giving advice to individual businesses. Amy Limay, my Night's Eyes, working with businesses across London, those that can open this Saturday, but also those that can't, about what more help we can give them in relation to live music venues. We've spoken to landlords, Monty, to relax rents even more, extend the rent-free period, and support with business rates where we can. The big concern I've got, Monty, is artists and those who are backstage who will now be made redundant and will have to find other work in other industries and may never come back to the arts and will have lost them forever. And so just to share how bad things are, James, we think we know 1 out of 6 jobs in our city are in this area. They contribute £52 billion towards our economy. We've already lost 1 in 6 jobs in this area, and that's just the start, and that's with a furlough scheme in place. And so you mentioned the theatre in Southampton. There are many theatres in London that are under threat because of COVID-19.
I think we're nearly done, but before you go, I just want to double check. This is the Monty I think it is, isn't it, on the line?
Yeah.
So I don't know if you heard Boris Johnson earlier saying that cricket can't be exempted from the COVID-19 loosenings because the teas, the changing rooms, and, to quote him verbatim, the other stuff makes cricket a greater risk for COVID-19. As one of the country's best known cricketers, I just wondered whether you recognise that description.
Yeah, I did listen to his, when he was on with Nick Farage, and sort of tried to call in to have a word with him to see.
Can I say, listeners, Monty said that, not me.
No, stop it.
Monty said that, not me.
Just behave yourself, Mr. Mayor. Nick Ferrari, not Nick Farage, Monty.
Oh,
but
yeah, sorry.
That's all right.
That's
quite all right. That ship has sailed. So back to the question of whether or not cricket has a bigger danger of COVID-19 transmission than tennis. What would you say as a test cricketer?
Yeah, well, look, I think what Boris is doing is just trying to see how the international cricket goes, where the test match starts next week, and if it goes quite successful and they have a sort of a template, an idea of how to, deal with cricket matches, then, hopefully they'll take that at recreational level where, people, will have to have some sort of safety precautions in place, because I think the last thing you want is an outbreak at a cricket club, at a local cricket club, and then suddenly, you have to close our cricket club down. And I think he's just being sort of taking precaution rather than just letting cricket, get back to recreational level, because every normal cricket club there's about 40 to 50 people, at the cricket club, and I think you don't want an outbreak. So I think he's just being sensible, and it's great to see international cricket being played again. And I think West Indies start, and then we have Pakistan as well. So
indeed we do. A vote of confidence for Boris Johnson's cricketing policies from Monty Panesar, no less. Many thanks to the Mayor of London, Sadiq Khan. We'll do it again in about a month, I think. I wonder whether we'll be in the same room by then. What do your waters tell you?
I think we may be in a month's time, and I think the good thing about the studio you're in is that I think we can safely social distance and stuff. And I think we're, the key thing is that although we are, easing restrictions, we should think about this as a new normal, rather than a return to business as usual. That means us making sure we wash our hands regularly and thoroughly. We just keep our distance. And I'm afraid, James, you can't give me a hug and embrace me warmly like you normally do for some time to come, James. I know you're going to miss that.
Well, we'll have our crosses to bear. Mayor of London, Sadiq Khan, many thanks indeed for your time, and indeed to all the callers. And we will pick over some of the issues raised there, and also perhaps cast our net a little wider, looking back to the earlier appearance on this radio station by another senior politician, in this case, of course, the Prime Minister. It is just coming up to 10 to 11.
The voices of LBC at the weekend. Andrew Castle.
This is a pandemic that's killing people. You're very happy to close the economy down, get furloughed, see your children's futures shattered educationally, but you're the same people who go out there and beat your chest over a victory for a football team or a quarantine rave. What makes you so special that you should do that?
Andrew Castle, every Saturday and Sunday morning from 7 on